Hi, welcome to another episode of Tech Interviews. On this week's show, we're picking up on a topic that we touched on kind of right at the start of some of the shows we reviewed, looking at the what next scenarios for many enterprises that began at the kind of the start of the COVID response for many organisations. And it was something that came up when I spoke to Tony Main in episode 131 about the changing way that enterprises are having to look at the way they manage and supply their users. You know, as we move from the idea of 1,000 users in a head office to 1,000 head offices with a single user in them. And so this week's show, my guest is somebody who approached me with a topic, and that topic dovetailed really nicely into that conversation about how they're developing solutions and working with their customers to change the way that those businesses and enterprises can look after and manage and integrate their remote workforce in with their day-to-day business activities. So it's a real hot topic for a lot of the conversations I have in podcast world as well as in my real job. So I thought it'd be an interesting episode for this week's show. So so let's jump into that and introduce my guest. So joining me this week is Doug Miller. Hi Doug, how are you doing?
Hi Paul, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining the show, Doug, and great to have you on Tech Interviews this week. And so before we dive into the topic, which I think is an important one, and one that's a real challenge for a lot of the organisations we're dealing with today. Before we do that, as I normally do on the show, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about who you are and what it is you do.
Sure, I'm the CEO, CTO of the Brightworks Group. We are a cloud transformation, digital transition, and IT modernization company based in the Midwest of the United States. We're located just on the north side of Indianapolis, Indiana, and work primarily with companies in the Midwest, though our footprint is actually international. We do work all over the United States with some customers in Central and South America. We've had some EU customers and Asian customers in the past. We don't right now, but we certainly have worked with some in the past. But our primary focus is on Midwestern companies.
So one thing I would like to add as we before we jump into the show is that you're the first person that's had a sword in the background as a Tech Interviews guest. So people are bound to ask, do you want to give us a brief on why the sword's there?
Yeah, so that's actually my big hobby is history, and particularly the military history of the late Renaissance to just before the 20th century. So I'm pretty serious about it. I've got close to an academic quality library, and I actually do some simulation design for board games and computer games around the topic. So if we were actually sitting down in my game room, there'd be all kinds of other props and pictures, and I've even got a big Prussian flag in the corner so I can use it to tweak my buddy who's a Napoleonist and very, very interested in the French. So there's a sword back there that I bought a few years ago, and my son made a plaque to hang it on the wall.
So part of the reason I wanted to mention that is obviously for those listening, Tech Interviews is now available on YouTube. And so Doug is the first guest that's given me a reason to tout, go and watch the video version of the show, as well as you can see Doug, as opposed to just listen to his voice. So Doug, thanks for bringing a prop. That's much appreciated.
Absolutely.
Let's as much as we'd love to talk about military history, I think we've also got kind of our own wars that we're fighting at the moment in the world of how on earth do we support users who, like I said in the introduction, have gone from 1,000 users in the kind of the walled secure surroundings of our head offices and our data centers to suddenly being distributed. It's interesting when you're talking about kind of where your customer base is and has been is that they're distributed absolutely all over the place, and not
Right.
necessarily just in country, maybe across continent, across the world. And that's introduced a whole bunch of new challenges to people. So, from your experience, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing your customers and enterprises in general now
Yeah.
being faced with?
It was very interesting, particularly back in March and April, and this is still a challenge for many companies today. But a lot of enterprises, small and mid-sized enterprises in particular, while they may have had disaster recovery plans, and while they may have had some capability to support remote users, nobody ever thought about the scenario where everyone was remote, and it's one thing to say, hey, go home, use the VPN to log in and work remotely. But when 1,000 people from your company are all trying to hit that same VPN concentrator, you don't have the bandwidth, you don't have the licenses, you don't have everybody set up to do VPN, nor did people really think about things like, that 30 meg down, 5 meg up asynchronous cable modem connection in somebody's home was sufficient for the occasional login. But when the significant other is home and the kids are home from school and they're streaming Netflix or trying to do their digital, suddenly there's no bandwidth at home either, right? So the number one, probably the first problem that we saw was that they just weren't ready for the networking piece of it. Then you stack on top of that those networks aren't secure. You're used to people being within, a set of protections around the corporate network, and suddenly they're at home, they're on cable modems, they may be using their home PCs that don't have all of the endpoint protection software in place. Or they went home, they took a corporate device home, and they're sharing it with the significant other and kids, and who knows what sites they're going to, right? So that becomes a problem. But as we've gotten further and further into this thing, one of the increasing problems seems to be, how do we support those users? And how do we provision new users? It's becoming a thing, I think, in a lot of enterprises that have started to kind of embrace the idea that, hey, maybe we won't bring everybody back. Maybe this is the new normal. And maybe we can start hiring people from places geographically distant from our headquarters, which is great, but then how do you get them a device? How do you get them set up correctly? How do you make sure that everything's working when you're doing all of this remotely? Because they haven't necessarily planned for it or thought it through. All of that starts to become a real challenge in terms of how do you keep that infrastructure safe, secure, reliable, and running in an environment that doesn't allow the same sort of centralized control that maybe they had before.
Yeah, and I think there's a whole bunch of really good points to kind of pick through there, and they're all things that I've seen in kind of the, part of the challenge that I see in my day job for lots of those organisations, and I think that idea that a lot of enterprise IT has never been designed with consumer IT type use. So the idea that we set up our laptops to join the corporate Wi-Fi, that's a
Right.
very different experience to the consumer Wi-Fi at home from your cable provider, or your kind of whoever your broadband provider is. And we see all kinds of challenges in that space. And I thought you made some really good points initially as well around that idea of nobody really thought about. So while they had the idea of being able to work from home, they didn't think of the idea of everybody working from home. That idea that one day we're all in the office, the next day none of us are in the office, and we're all trying to hit all of our services all of the time.
Right.
I think we're genuine challenges, and something that we saw very early on was the big challenge, perhaps for the first 4 or 5 weeks, was scaling, VPN support, scaling the ability to get devices into the hands of people. Like I said, if people
Right.
if people in the office, because probably like me and you and maybe many of the listeners, we're probably used to using laptops and have done for a long time. But for a lot of people who are generally office bound, they probably have a PC. It's not as easy to
Right.
pick the PC up and take it home, because where do you put it, and all of those kind of things.
Or even, we deal a lot in the architecture, engineering, construction management space. And we're dealing with people that are doing pretty high-end 3D CAD work. So, they're using desktop machines with AutoCAD certified graphics cards. There's not a lot of laptop options that cover some of that, right? And they're used to large monitors, large displays. Often they want to print to big plotting devices. None of that equipment is designed for home use, right? I mean, who's going to wheel a 6 foot wide plotter home to put in their spare bedroom?
Yeah, nobody wants to stay living with their significant other, as you mentioned earlier on. And
Right.
so, I mean, interestingly with that, so you've given some of the experiences there, but I mean, from your experience looking at how organisations traditionally would deliver this kind of support to their users, and how they would deploy enterprise technology, what are some of the things that you've seen have really started to fail over the last few months? As this, we've had this big shift in the way that we're working. This idea that we now have these very distributed workforces. So what have you seen as the major problems that companies have had to deal with, and
There's
perhaps are still
really,
struggling to deal with?
yeah, there's really been a couple, and interestingly, they're not on sort of the infrastructure side, though there certainly have been tons of problems. We talked about VPNs and network bandwidth and all those kinds of things. But what those feed are actual business problems. And probably the biggest class of those that I've seen are a whole set of situations where companies had effectively manual processes of some kind. It may have been, right, that something came out of purchasing and was then hand carried to somebody else, or it came out and then it had to be emailed or printed out, or converted from a form to a PDF. Or the final step in a process was to create a paper file and store it someplace. And now we need to reference that material, and it's unavailable because that's all in file cabinets in the head office, and no one is. So those kind of breakdowns where organizations didn't digitally transform a process in advance of this, and then there's some key important step that nobody thought about, and it completely threw sand in the gears because they suddenly couldn't process payroll, or they were getting orders from one side and couldn't fulfill orders on the other because there was that step where Anne literally got up and walked across the office and handed a purchase order to somebody, and now Anne's not in the office and the other person's not in the office. And those are the real problems that we saw that we've been seeing that have really started to create breakdowns in businesses. They didn't, even if you solved all of the, hey, everybody can log in remotely and everybody's got a device, the processes are still broken. That then kind of also has transferred into, I had a really interesting discussion with a company, maybe a month, 6 weeks ago, where they were talking about, hey, everybody's working at home and we think we're going to stay working at home. And we're going to be able to reduce our real estate footprint. So we're all, CFOs are really happy about that. They're going to save money. Said, okay, well, that's pretty cool. What do how are you having people work at home? They said, yeah, we're gonna start requiring people to have, sort of a minimum bandwidth. And I said, okay. And are you going to reimburse people for that? And this person got this very perplexed look on their face and went, well, no, why would we do that? Working at home's a privilege. No, working at home was a privilege 18 months ago. Now, where you don't have desks and you're not giving them a network connection and you're not giving them a phone, and you've basically outsourced your space needs to their spare bedroom, it's not a privilege. So the other big breakdown has been in policy and how we treat workforce, how we treat our people in this new environment. Thinking hasn't caught up with the reality yet.
And that's a really interesting point, and it's fascinating that the two of the kind of big examples you've seen have been much more around policy and working practice actually rather than technology, and I'm sure those two things kind of feed each other, and say
Absolutely.
I love the idea of the 6 foot wide plotter being wheeled in to the living room and you're trying to explain why you need it in the living room, while everybody else is trying to maneuver around it, but they are, and I think they do feed into that whole point about the changes that many enterprises have gone through and have had to have gone through. Nobody had really ever planned for. We all had DR plans and continuity plans, but how many of them really looked at the fact that not only would we all not be returning to an office for the short term, but actually it may become the long term and the long term transition. And you talked before as well about the idea for those businesses that had not already started to take a lot of their a lot of their processes digital. So we saw, for example, for our customers who'd already made, for the people I deal with, who'd already made significant investments in moving many of their processes and systems into public cloud, or hosting somewhere else. That was a huge benefit to them because actually that move from all turning up into the office on a Monday and then all working, from home or some other location on a Tuesday was a much easier shift than for those companies. So for some companies that's always going to be difficult. They're manufacturing, they're people handling big machines. But actually for the
Right.
companies where that could be an easy shift, then that was a much easier shift if all of your stuff was not sat in your data center and you was having to worry about
Right.
VPNs and etc. So for our for the company I work at in the day job, we were able to do that. Our main back office systems were already in the public cloud. Our telephony system was in the public cloud. The ability
Right.
to give our users the access to all of those systems from home, either with a corporate device or their own device, was relatively straightforward, and it allowed us to change our working practices smoothly and relatively quickly. It actually took us by surprise how easy it was. So while a lot of the problems that you've seen then have been those kind of logistical problems and working practice problems, how have you seen organisations then either use technology or not to start to address some of those problems? If somebody's listening to this and saying, yeah, I have felt and still feel a lot of that pain. What are some of the kind of things that they could be doing to start to overcome some of those challenges?
Absolutely. And I think, there's two places to look. One is on the technology side itself. And then one is on the leadership and policy side, right? Thinking about these things. On the technology side, we've been pretty fortunate. My background is one that so I came out of both manufacturing IT and healthcare IT, designing data centers for and running data centers for level 1 trauma centers and regional burn centers, where we had to have the reliability, we had to have the uptime. You can't be down if you're a level 1 trauma center, right? They send the ambulances someplace else. So I have a perception of reliability that's tied to that. At the same time, in those kind of circumstances, we had EMS crews, we had people in ambulances that needed technology. We had clinics around the city, so there was a lot of distributed stuff, and that got me very, very involved very early on in technologies like virtualization that it eventually led to a lot of involvement in VDI. And it's been interesting. I haven't seen a lot of enterprises that have been able to successfully implement VDI on their own. It's a complex, many-layered kind of thing to do. And unless you've got people that really understand it, it can be a real challenge to run. But it's also really key to solving the kind of problems that we're talking about here. Enterprises need to be able to centrally manage and centrally support things, particularly endpoints. And when you start distributing endpoints all over the place into environments where you have no control, you encounter a couple of problems. One, they're really difficult to support, right? You've got complex devices in non-technical people's hands that you don't necessarily have a good way to manage and lay hands on. Then the other problem that you have is that you're trying to ship data around. And that's the real problem. That's the thing you really want to avoid, is having all of your data suddenly spread out to thousands of endpoints all over the place that you don't know where they are or who's using them or who's touching them or how are you going to recover that data if somebody leaves the organization. That's a major challenge. And I believe the solution to that is never send that data out. And that's where technologies like VDI, a lot of the new endpoint cloud solutions that we're seeing from Microsoft, whether it's public cloud or private cloud, keeping that data, keeping the actual endpoint and compute in centralized data centers, and then providing endpoint devices that effectively, whether they're repurposed laptops and desktops or just logging in from somebody's own device, basically a thin client kind of experience gives you back a lot of that control and a lot of that management capability. Some of that can be done through SaaS apps. I'm sure you guys are doing a lot of that. We do a lot of that. But if you're trying to deliver that true, operating system desktop experience, you got to look at some of those kind of technologies, I think.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, no, just to add in there, Doug, actually, and there's some kind of, as you were explaining that caught my attention. It's a really interesting example, that idea of, if you take the kind of the standard Windows desktop, maybe for somebody who's using Office 365, they've got access to SharePoint and they have the OneDrive synchronization engine on their machine, which allows them to an extent to do the kind of thing. So although it's not centralized desktops, it does centralize the data, but still gives the user, this is a really basic example, but still gives the user that, via synchronization and a level of caching, gives the user that local machine experience. But like I said, the technology exists, but I know I've certainly seen, I'm sure you have, where it's the leadership of the business does not necessarily want to embrace that technology because they're still saying, I've got file servers and I want to work in this way, and I don't want to roll out this technology because they've still got a view of, you gave the example before, they've still got a view of somebody in the office who hands a piece of paper to somebody and puts it in a filing cabinet. And maybe to a degree they're thinking that's going to come back eventually. Are you still seeing a reticence for organizations to grab that technology and appreciate that the changes that we've been through over the last 6-7 months, not in all cases, it'd be wrong for me to say in all cases that are going to be permanent changes, but I think for a lot of people, if they're not embracing that technology shift now, they're really missing an opportunity.
They are, and that's the great way to phrase it, right? I think that the sort of silver lining of all of this from a technologist's perspective, and frankly from a business efficiency perspective, is that it's given us some energy, some fuel to move these remote working technologies ahead much more quickly than they have in the last several years. I've told several people, that in 6 months, we jumped about 5 years in terms of technology adoption. We're definitely seeing a lot of customers who have looked at this and said, we got to do something about this. We've got to adopt these technologies because even if we're going to come back to the office largely, we don't know when something like this will happen again. And this was so painful. We don't want to have it happen again, right? I mean, you mentioned earlier the difficulties of VPNs and all that stuff. Well, supply chains were empty. You couldn't get. And I was even baffled that, big players like Ingram had trouble providing VPN licensing. I mean, it's completely virtual, right? It's not, there's no physical component.
Heck yeah, it's just a number. Just give me
right,
a number.
It's just a number. And they still couldn't fulfill the orders. I can remember in March trying to call Ingram and some of our folks literally sitting on the phone for 2 hours with Ingram trying to get VPN licenses.
I just like to point out that other distributors failed equally. So just so Ingram don't think we're picking on them. But actually, Doug, I think what's really important in that as well, and that's a really good example because, from a business point of view, and you've talked a lot about kind of business impact with this, that a lot of the problems that we've seen around that distributed workforce are not necessarily technology ones. In a world today where a lot of the changes that we make, and a lot of the user experience and user demand is, if you're not giving me the thing I want, it's very easy for me to go and find somebody else who will. I think while there was leeway early on during kind of a lot of the COVID response, regardless of where you are in the world, we've all had some kind of response. While I think there was a lot of leeway and patience initially, as you said in that example, if we find ourselves in a situation, it may not be another wave of COVID, but it might be something else in 2 or 3 years' time, that there will be a lot less patience for organisations to kind of go through that growing pain again. So I think if somebody's listening to this from a business point of view and thinking, well, maybe we're nearly at the end of this and we've kind of dealt with it and we don't need to do any more kind of change or transformation, I think that's a useful warning for people to have, that people will be an awful lot less patient in the future. Well, Doug, look, this is time has really flown here in this conversation, because I think it's a conversation we clearly both find fascinating, and hopefully listeners and viewers will do so also. I did want to give an opportunity though for you to just kind of, before we wrap up, to talk a little bit about what you guys are doing in this space. So so for people who maybe have not come across Brightworks before and the kind of work that you do, what are the kind of things that you've been doing to help your customers overcome some of these kind of remote management, remote support challenges?
Right. So we started from this. This has been kind of a perfect storm for us. Our philosophy has always been to help our customers kind of get out of owning a lot of on-prem infrastructure and helping them set up so they can so they can have their workforce work safely from anywhere. So we have solutions. Our primary solution is known as Complete Cloud. And it is a 100% private cloud solution that provides all servers, all desktops, a complete IT infrastructure in a private data center, private cloud environment for a single fixed price per user per month. When we migrate folks to this, we had, for example, right before COVID, migrated about 100-person civil engineering firm. And COVID hit, and they, in 24 hours, just picked up and went home, right? There was no interruption at all, because everything they were doing was already in a centralized environment that they could access from anywhere. So our practice and our focus has been very heavily around trying to help people set up those environments through all kinds of different cloud-based solutions, whether it's our private cloud solution or whether it's more point solutions. We work with a company called Exigence out of Israel, actually, that provides a cloud-based major incident management system for enterprises. So you have an outage right now, how do you bring your remote team together to deal with that? Exigence actually provides that online war room, timeline, tracking, conferencing, ties to your monitoring system. It gives you a single place for all of that. So I spent a lot of time evaluating tools and partners and vendors that can bring those kind of solutions to our customers and allow them to just, it doesn't matter whether you're in the office or not, you've now got the capability.
Yeah, and I think that kind of flexibility is hugely important, isn't it? And it's a conversation we have an awful lot of the time, and one we've increasingly seen over the last 6-7 months is that idea of hand off some of these big challenges that you see as organisations to specialists, people who can deliver them for you. So, I mean, maybe even some of the weirdest things. We've seen lots of conversations around licensing. If you think right at the start of COVID, that Microsoft, and generously from a Microsoft point of view, allowed people, if you want to use Microsoft Teams or Office 365, here's an E1 license you can run for 6 months. However, when we got to the end of as we start to actually now, now's the time we're getting to the end of that 6-month period for many. They're now looking at that and saying, well, what do I do? I've become ingrained.
Right.
And actually, I've got no idea how the Microsoft licensing model works, whether that's the right route for me. How do I deal with that? So there's an opportunity there to, if you've got some experience of that, and the way you've described kind of how your organisation works, it's very much that. We've got all of this experience of delivering this stuff for you.
Right.
You get on with operating your business, doing the thing that you exist to do. Let us just deliver IT solutions, regardless of how distributed your workforce is, regardless of whatever changes we've got to evolve and deal with. We can scale that, we can deliver that quickly. I think is a powerful case. So, well, look, Doug, as we wrap up here, I often like to ask people, if somebody's listening to this show and are still looking at the way they look after their users remotely, how they manage, how they provision, how they support going forward. If they were to look at their business today, is there a couple of tips that you could give them briefly, just to say these would be a couple of things that I would start off looking at?
Yeah, I think at the base, right, you've got to recognize that there's been a change. That's the first thing, right? Trying to say, how do I maintain the current way we're doing things in the face of all this? Don't do that. Understand there's a change, embrace it, and then start looking at you don't, and this is a challenge I think a lot of IT departments have. They're so worried about proving their value that they're unwilling to ask for help. So yeah, there are a lot of specialists out there who really can help you. Begin to look at your IT as a utility. It should be the same as walking in and flipping a light switch. It's just got to be there. So how do you provide that? What parts of this are strategic for you to provide? And what parts of it, and I think your point about licensing is great, right? There are people out there who their whole business is about managing licensing. Stop trying to do it in-house. Grab those folks, work with them so that you can be focused on what really matters to your business. Not whether you need 6E3 and 48E1. That's a waste of your time. Don't be worried that you're going to lose your job because you're not taking care of all that little stuff. Deliver real value. Look at things like you mentioned earlier before the call we were talking, things like Windows Autopilot. That kind of automation is going to be key for your ability to support remote users. So the more you can automate and automate securely, learn PowerShell, adopt those new Microsoft technologies that are oriented around this stuff. That's the real strategic stuff that's going to pay dividends to you. But mostly, always be looking. And whether this is during COVID or not, what are you doing that's proactive as opposed to reactive?
I think if my favourite takeaway from all of what you've said today is being, if you're looking at how do I keep doing all the things that I used to do and keep doing that, don't do that. I think that's a
Don't
great
do
tip.
that.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip. Well, look, Doug, we're kind of out of time now, but if
Yeah.
people want to find out more about you, about what Brightworks do, or just to kind of come and stalk you online, is there ways they can do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Please visit our website at brightworksgroup.net. We've got a lot of content there, a lot of blog posts, white papers. We share a lot of information about these kind of topics. Also, LinkedIn is probably the best social media place to find us. We've got a company page, Brightworks Group, and my personal LinkedIn account. Feel free to reach out. And again, we share a great deal of content and information there every single day. So looking forward to meeting some of your listeners online.
That's great, Doug. Look, I really appreciate that. I think that's been a fascinating chat, and your experience and some of the things you've seen and shared. I think people will find hugely valuable. So, Doug, thanks for being on Tech Interviews, and hey, I look forward to having you back on again sometime in the near future.
Great, thank you, Paul. Would really look forward to it, and love to do that again.
So now you can now get back to using your sword for useful things. So, hey, Doug, thanks for being on Tech Interviews, and speak to you soon.
Great, thanks, Paul.
I hope you enjoyed that. For show notes, pop over to techstringy.com. We'll also find all our previous Tech Interviews episodes. And if you've got an idea for a show or would like to propose a guest, then why not drop me an email at podcast@techstringy.com. If you want to make sure you catch the next episode of Tech Interviews, then please subscribe. You can subscribe here on YouTube, as well as in all good homes of podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Spotify. So until next time, thanks for watching.